She slipped through the door, 20 minutes late, hoping no one would notice. But when the first officer turned and saw her face, 300 people rose as one, and the ceremony stopped cold. The ceremony had been underway for nearly 40 minutes when the heavy oak door at the back of the Naval Memorial Hall opened with a soft creak that shouldn't have been heard over the speaker's voice. But somehow, in that moment, it was. The hall itself was everything you'd expect from a military venue steeped in decades of tradition. Polished marble floors reflected the afternoon light streaming through tall windows. 2 massive American flags flanked the stage, their fabric hanging motionless in the climate-controlled air. Between them, a projection screen displayed the official seal of the United States Navy. Rows of wooden chairs stretched back from the podium, and in those chairs sat the kind of gathering that represented the very spine of American military heritage. In the front rows, admirals and captains sat in dress whites and blues, their uniforms adorned with ribbons that told stories of deployments to distant waters, of commands held and missions accomplished. The metal of their medals caught the light as they shifted in their seats. Behind them, rows of junior officers, some so young their faces still carried the smoothness of recent academy graduation, others weathered by years at sea. Master chiefs with anchors on their sleeves sat alongside senior chiefs, their collective decades of service adding up to centuries of naval tradition. Further back, the veterans, men and women in their 60s, 70s, some even older, wearing the blue blazers and khaki trousers of veteran associations, their covers resting on their laps, their lapels decorated with pins and insignia that marked them as members of a brotherhood forged in saltwater and sacrifice. Submarine veterans, surface warfare officers, naval aviators, corpsmen, each one carrying memories of a navy that stretched back through Korea, Vietnam, the Cold War, Desert Storm, and among them the families, wives who'd waited through deployments, husbands who'd held down the home front, children, now grown, who'd spent their childhoods saying goodbye at piers and hello at homecomings, Gold Star families who'd received folded flags instead of reunion embraces. The speaker at the podium was a rear admiral, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone who'd delivered countless addresses at countless ceremonies. He was in the middle of remarks about the Naval Academy class of 1985, celebrating their 40th reunion, talking about the bonds forged during plebe summer and the paths they'd taken since graduation. The class of '85 served during the Cold War's final chapter, the Admiral was saying, and then found themselves redefining naval operations in the decades that followed, from the Gulf War to operations in the Arabian Sea, from humanitarian missions to... That's when the door opened. The woman who entered was trying to be invisible. She wore a simple navy blue dress, nothing fancy, the kind you might wear to church or a business meeting. Her grey hair was pulled back in a neat bun. She carried a small purse clutched against her side. She was maybe 70, maybe older. It was hard to tell. Her face had the kind of weathered dignity that comes from a lifetime of holding things together. She paused just inside the door, her eyes adjusting to the interior light after the brightness outside. There was something apologetic in the way she stood there, something that said she knew she was late and was hoping to slip in without causing a disruption. Her hand was still on the door handle, as if she was considering whether to stay or leave. The Admiral paused mid-sentence, not because he'd seen her, but because something had shifted in the room. A ripple of attention moving backward through the rows like a wave approaching shore. It started in the back rows where the older veterans sat. A Master Chief in the last row turned his head at the sound of the door. He looked, and his entire body went still. His hand, which had been resting casually on his knee, suddenly gripped the fabric of his trousers. His lips parted slightly, and in the silence of the hall you could almost hear his sharp intake of breath. The woman took a tentative step down the side aisle, looking for an empty seat near the back. She kept her eyes down, not wanting to meet anyone's gaze, not wanting to draw attention. But it was too late for that. The Master Chief stood up, not slowly, not carefully. He simply rose to his feet as if pulled by strings, his chair scraping against the marble floor with a sound that cut through the Admiral's speech like a knife. The woman glanced up at the sound, confused. The Master Chief was staring at her, his face transformed by recognition and something deeper, something that looked like disbelief mixed with reverence. And then the man next to him stood, a submarine veteran with silver dolphins on his blazer. He'd turned to see what had caused his friend to stand, and when his eyes found the woman, he too rose, his hand moving automatically to his heart. It spread like wildfire. Row by row, seat by seat, people began standing, not in organized military precision, but in a spontaneous wave of recognition that moved forward through the hall like a physical force. The veterans stood first, many of them with tears already forming in their eyes. Then the active duty officers, turning in their seats to see what was happening, their training kicking in even before they understood why. When they saw the woman, they too rose to their feet. The Admiral stopped talking altogether now, his prepared remarks forgotten. He looked out at his audience, seeing 300 people rising to their feet, their attention focused not on him, but on something behind them. He stepped away from the podium, confusion creasing his face. The junior officers in the middle rows stood up, following the lead of their seniors, even though many of them didn't yet understand what was happening. They knew military protocol, knew the customs and courtesies, and they knew that when everyone around you stands, you stand too. But this wasn't a planned moment. This wasn't the national anthem or the arrival of colors. This was something else entirely. The families stood, the Gold Star mothers and fathers, the Navy wives who'd spent decades waiting, the grown children of sailors. They stood because everyone was standing, but also because something in the atmosphere of the room had changed, had become charged with an emotion too big to sit through. The woman had stopped walking. She stood frozen in the side aisle, about 5 rows from the back, her face pale and stricken. She'd been trying to be inconspicuous, trying to slip in and pay her respects without anyone noticing, and now hundreds of eyes were on her. Hundreds of people were standing in her honor, and she looked like she wanted the floor to open up and swallow her whole. Her hand came up to her throat in a gesture that was part shock, part distress. She shook her head slightly, a tiny movement that seemed to say, "No, please don't. I didn't come here for this." But they kept standing. Every single person in that hall was on their feet now. The sound of chairs scraping, fabric rustling, shoes shuffling on marble, it all faded into a profound silence. The kind of silence that feels alive, that presses against your eardrums and makes your heart beat louder in your chest. An older captain in the 3rd row, his chest heavy with ribbons, turned fully around to look at her. His hand moved up in a salute, held there crisp and perfect, even though he was in civilian clothes and she wasn't in uniform. Tears were streaming down his face, running into the grey of his mustache. A female commander stood next to him, and she too was crying, one hand pressed to her mouth, the other clutching the shoulder of the person next to her for support. The woman in the blue dress stood there taking it all in, and you could see the moment when it hit her, the full weight of what was happening. The realization that these people knew who she was, knew what she represented, and that this moment of recognition had been building for 40 years. Her composure, so carefully maintained, began to crack. Her shoulders shook once, twice. Her eyes squeezed shut, and a single tear traced its way down her cheek. The Admiral had made his way to the edge of the stage now, trying to see what everyone else was seeing. When his gaze finally found the woman in the blue dress, standing alone in the aisle with 300 people on their feet around her, his expression changed. The confusion vanished, replaced by understanding, then by something that looked like awe. He brought his hand up in a salute as well, holding it there even though he knew she couldn't see it with her eyes closed. A young ensign near the back, maybe 23 years old, fresh out of Annapolis, leaned over to the senior chief next to him. "Who is she?" he whispered. his voice carrying in the silence more than he intended. The senior chief didn't take his eyes off the woman when he answered. His voice was thick, barely controlled. "That's Margaret Holbrook," he said. "She's the reason half the people in this room are alive." The ensign's face went blank with incomprehension. He looked at the woman again. This small, elderly woman, in a simple dress, who looked like someone's grandmother, who looked like she'd give you cookies and ask about your day. He looked at her, and he couldn't connect what he was seeing with what he'd just heard, but the senior chief wasn't looking at him anymore. None of them were looking at anything except Margaret Holbrook, who stood with her eyes still closed, her hand still at her throat, trying desperately to hold herself together. The silence stretched. 1 second, 5 seconds, 10 seconds. It felt like an hour. The weight of 300 people standing in respect, in recognition, in gratitude for something that hadn't been spoken aloud yet, but hung in the air like smoke. Then the Admiral moved. He stepped down from the stage, his shoes clicking on the marble with sharp precision. He walked down the center aisle with purpose, with the kind of determination that comes from knowing exactly what needs to happen next, even if it's not in any prepared program. Margaret opened her eyes when she heard him approaching. She looked at him with an expression that was equal parts pleading and resignation. She shook her head again, more firmly this time. "I didn't mean to interrupt," she said, her voice so soft that only the people nearby could hear it. "I just wanted to be here. I didn't mean for—" But the Admiral wasn't listening to her protests. He stopped directly in front of her, came to attention, and rendered the sharpest, most precise salute of his career. He held it there, his eyes locked on hers, until she had no choice but to see it, to acknowledge it, to accept it. "Mrs. Holbrook," he said, his voice carrying now because the room was so silent, so attentive. "On behalf of everyone in this hall, on behalf of the United States Navy, and on behalf of every sailor who came home because of what you did, would you please come forward?" Margaret's face crumpled. Whatever wall she'd been hiding behind, whatever armor she'd built over 40 years, it shattered in that moment. But she didn't collapse. She stood there, tears flowing freely now, and slowly, so slowly, she nodded. The Admiral dropped his salute and extended his hand, not to shake, to guide, to support, to escort. Margaret placed her trembling hand in his, and together they began walking toward the front of the hall. As they moved down the center aisle, every person they passed remained standing. Some were crying openly now, others stood at attention with military bearing, but their eyes were red, their jaws clenched with emotion. A few reached out as she passed, not to touch her, but in gestures of blessing, of gratitude, of connection. A submarine veteran with a cane stood straighter than he'd stood in years. A Gold Star mother clutched her folded flag tighter to her chest. A young sailor, who couldn't have been more than 19, held his hand over his heart and mouthed words that might have been "thank you," or might have been a prayer. Margaret and the Admiral reached the front of the hall. He guided her up the 3 steps to the stage, his hand never leaving hers, making sure she was steady. When they reached the podium, he turned her to face the assembled crowd. 300 people, still standing, still silent, still holding that moment of recognition like a sacred thing. Margaret looked out at them, at this sea of uniforms and veteran blazers and tear-stained faces, and for the first time since she'd walked through that door, she let them see her, really see her. Not the apologetic latecomer trying to be invisible, but the woman who had every right to be there, the woman these people had been waiting 40 years to honor. She stood there, small and gray-haired and trembling, and she was the most powerful presence in that entire hall. The Admiral stepped back, giving her the stage. He didn't introduce her, he didn't explain. He simply stood beside her, at attention, and waited. Because everyone in that room already knew who she was. Everyone except the youngest sailors and the newest officers. And they would learn. They would hear the story that had just been unlocked by a creaking door and a woman who wanted to be invisible. But first, they would stand. They would bear witness. They would hold this moment for her, hold it like the precious thing it was, hold it until she was ready to speak or ready to leave, or ready to finally, after 40 years, accept the honor she'd been running from. The silence held. 300 people standing in a Naval Memorial Hall on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, standing for Margaret Holbrook, standing for what she'd done, standing for what she'd lost, standing because some acts of courage are so profound that the only proper response is to rise to your feet and bear witness. And Margaret stood there too, on that stage, looking out at them with tears running down her face, realizing that she couldn't hide anymore, couldn't deflect anymore, couldn't spend one more day telling herself that what she'd done didn't matter. Because to these people, it mattered more than anything in the world. Margaret Holbrook had not wanted to come. The invitation had sat in her kitchen drawer for 3 weeks, pulled from the trash twice, before she finally decided she couldn't ignore it anymore. Naval Academy class of 1985 40th Reunion Memorial Ceremony. She'd known what that meant. She'd known they might remember. But she'd hoped she could slip in unnoticed, pay her respects and leave before anyone recognized her. Now, standing on that stage, with 300 people staring at her like she was something sacred, Margaret felt exposed in a way she hadn't felt in 40 years. The Admiral stood beside her, his hand hovering near her elbow. Her legs were trembling. Her purse was clutched so tightly her knuckles had gone white. "I didn't come here for this," she said, her voice stronger now, carrying across the silent hall. "I came to honor them, not for this." The Admiral's voice was gentle but firm. "Mrs. Holbrook, they're honoring you because you came to honor them. That's who you've always been." Margaret shook her head. For a moment, she looked like she might bolt, might walk off that stage and back into the anonymity she'd protected for decades. But her feet wouldn't move. Something held her there, something stronger than fear, stronger than shame. In the third row, a captain whispered to his wife, "I was on the Vincennes, July of '85. I wouldn't be here without her." Behind them, a submarine veteran spoke to his grandson, a midshipman at the academy. "That woman saved my boat, saved 40 men, including me." Udi, the young man, stared at Margaret, trying to reconcile this small, elderly woman with the idea of saving submarines. How? What did she do? His grandfather shook his head, fighting emotion. "Later. I'll tell you later." Margaret heard the whispers rippling through the crowd like wind through grass. Each one reminded her why she'd stayed away. Each one carried memories she'd tried not to bear alone. Because that was the thing. She hadn't done it alone. She'd been part of something that had cost more than anyone should pay, and accepting recognition felt like betraying everyone who hadn't made it home. The Admiral watched her face, reading the conflict with practiced understanding. He knew that for someone like Margaret Holbrook, being honored felt wrong, felt selfish, felt like theft. "Mrs. Holbrook," he said quietly, "you don't have to say anything. Just stand here and let them see you. Let them say thank you. That's all they want." Margaret's eyes swept across the faces looking up at her. So many lives that had continued past 1985. Lives that had become marriages, children, grandchildren, careers. Lives that existed because of decisions made in desperate hours when everything hung by a thread. "I didn't save anyone," she said, her voice cracking. "I was just doing my job, what anyone would have done." A Master Chief's voice rang out from the middle rows, rough with authority. "That's not true, Ma'am, and you know it." Margaret's head snapped toward him. The Master Chief stepped into the aisle. "What you did wasn't just your job. What you did was impossible. What you did was heroic. And 40 years of pretending otherwise doesn't change that truth." Other voices joined his. "He's right. She deserves this. We owe her everything." Margaret closed her eyes against the wave of affirmation. She swayed slightly, but when the Admiral moved to steady her, she waved him off. She'd stood strong through worse. She could stand strong now. When she opened her eyes, they were clearer, more focused. "If I tell you why I don't deserve this, will you sit down?" The Admiral started to protest, but she held up a hand. "Please, let me explain. Then you'll understand why I shouldn't be here." The Admiral studied her, then slowly nodded. He gestured to a chair near the podium. "Then at least sit while you speak." "Sit." Margaret moved to the chair carefully, placing her purse in her lap, folding her hands with the precision of someone maintaining control. The Admiral positioned a microphone near her and stepped back. The crowd remained standing, all of them, like witnesses, like sentinels, like people who understood that what was about to be spoken needed to be received, standing up. Margaret looked down at her hands, gathering herself. Then she looked up, and when she spoke, her voice was quiet but clear. "My husband's name was Lieutenant Commander Robert Holbrook. He was a radar intercept officer. He flew F-14 Tomcats off the USS Ranger. Some of you might have served with him." Several heads nodded. An older aviator closed his eyes, remembering. In June 1985, Bobby was conducting operations in the Mediterranean. Libya was testing boundaries. Bobby had been deployed 4 months. We had 2 sons. Matthew was 6. Daniel was 4. She paused, and something shifted in her expression. The careful closing of a door, too painful to enter, but she was opening it now. On June 28th, Bobby's plane developed mechanical problems. The pilot initiated emergency procedures, but the ejection system malfunctioned. They went down over water, 7 miles from the carrier. The hall went completely still. The pilot didn't make it out. Bobby ejected, but his parachute didn't fully deploy. He went into the water hard. He was alive, but badly hurt. She stopped, looking at her hands. The Admiral moved closer, offering an escape. But Margaret shook her head and continued. They got him to the carrier. 6 hours of surgery, broken back, punctured lung, internal bleeding. He needed specialized care they didn't have on board. He needed evacuation to Germany. Margaret's voice had gone flat, stripped of emotion. The problem was, that same day there'd been a cargo plane crash in Italy. Multiple casualties. The medical evacuation aircraft were being used for crash victims. The Navy said Bobby was stable enough to wait 24 hours. Someone in the crowd made a small sound. They knew how these stories went. "But I knew Bobby," Margaret said. "I knew he didn't have 24 hours. Something in my gut told me if he wasn't moved immediately, he wouldn't survive." She looked up, meeting their eyes, showing the steel beneath. "So I picked up the phone and started making calls." The Admiral closed his eyes. This was the part that had become legend. "I called everyone I could think of. Base commander, fleet headquarters, the Pentagon. I was a Navy wife. I knew the system, knew the chain of command, and I knew that somewhere, someone could authorize an emergency evacuation." A ghost of a smile crossed her face. "I also knew most of them wouldn't take a lieutenant commander's wife seriously. They'd tell me to be patient, trust the process. But I couldn't be patient. When they told me no, I called someone else. 6 hours of calls, refusing to take no for an answer. A captain in the second row spoke up. "Tell them who you finally called, ma'am." Margaret's hands clenched. "I called a senator, a man Bobby had served under. I called his home at 2 in the morning and told him if my husband wasn't evacuated in 6 hours, he would die. I asked him to please do something." The hall held its breath. The senator made calls, pulled strings. Within 2 hours, a medical aircraft was diverted to the Ranger. They flew Bobby to Germany. The doctors said if he'd waited 4 more hours, the internal bleeding would have killed him. She stopped. 4 hours. The difference between widow and wife, between 2 boys losing their father and keeping him. "So you see," Margaret said, looking at the 300 people still standing, "I didn't save anyone. I just made phone calls. I was a pushy Navy wife who wouldn't take no for an answer. That's all." The Master Chief shook his head slowly. "No, ma'am, that's not all, because what you didn't know was that the aircraft diverted to pick up your husband was supposed to evacuate casualties from that cargo crash." Margaret's face went pale. "What? That plane carried 6 patients. When it was diverted, those 6 had to wait. The medical teams had to stabilize them longer than planned, had to work harder, had to figure out how to keep those men alive. He paused. What you didn't know is that one team realized they didn't have enough blood for major surgery, so they organized emergency donors from all available personnel. 50 volunteers lined up. And because they had extra time, they developed a mass donation and transfusion system that had never been done in a field setting. Margaret shook her head, not understanding. A Navy surgeon spoke up. That protocol was written up, Mrs. Holbrook, standardized, incorporated into tactical medicine across all branches. Over 40 years, that protocol has saved thousands of lives. Thousands. Margaret's mouth opened, but no sound came. And that's just the beginning, the Admiral said softly. Your actions that day, your refusal to accept no, your persistence, it became a case study. It led to reforms in medical evacuations, notification procedures, communication protocols between medical units and command. He looked at Margaret, eyes bright. You didn't just save your husband. You changed the system. You made it better for every service member and family that came after. That's why everyone stood when you walked in. Margaret sat frozen. She'd spent 40 years thinking she'd been selfish, thinking she'd diverted resources from other wounded soldiers. She'd carried that guilt like stones in her pockets, and now they were telling her it had been something else entirely. That her desperate love, her refusal to accept loss, it had created ripples she'd never seen, saved lives she'd never known existed, changed things in ways she'd never imagined. She looked at the 300 people standing and finally understood why they wouldn't sit down. The Admiral extended his hand. Mrs. Holbrook, on behalf of the United States Navy, on behalf of every sailor whose life was saved by the reforms that came from your actions, would you please allow us to honor you the way you deserve? Margaret felt something crack open inside her chest. Some vault locked 40 years ago, finally breaking its seal. Inside was grief and fear, yes, but also pride, also strength, also the fierce, unbreakable love that had driven her to fight for her husband's life. Slowly, shakily, she stood. She placed her hand in the Admiral's. And for the first time since walking through that door, she stood straight, lifted her chin, and let them see her as exactly what she was, a woman who had fought for love and life, and in fighting had changed the world. Yes, she whispered, yes. And the room erupted. The applause started like distant thunder, then built into something that shook the walls. 300 pairs of hands coming together, 300 voices rising in a roar that lifted the very air. Margaret stood there, the Admiral's hand still holding hers, and felt the sound wash over her like a wave she couldn't resist. She'd spent 40 years building walls around this moment, and in 10 minutes those walls had been demolished, not torn down violently, but dismantled brick by people who understood those walls had been protecting not her pride, but her grief, not her accomplishments, but her guilt. The Admiral waited for the applause to quiet. When it finally subsided, he turned to Margaret. There's more you need to hear. There are people who've been waiting 40 years to tell you what your actions meant. Will you listen? Margaret's throat was too tight to speak. She simply nodded. Who wants to go first? The Admiral asked. A man stood from the front row. Early 60s, Navy captain's uniform, chest decorated with ribbons. But as he stepped into the aisle and faced Margaret, his face showed the vulnerability of someone much younger, carrying something heavy for a very long time. Mrs. Holbrook, my name is Captain David Richardson. In June 1985, I was a lieutenant junior grade, a supply officer on the USS Ranger. I was in the hangar bay when they brought your husband aboard after the rescue. Margaret's breath caught. This man had seen Bobby that day. I wasn't medical personnel, Richardson continued, voice shaking, just a supply officer who happened to be nearby. But they needed every hand, so I helped carry the stretcher. I saw his injuries. I saw the blood, and I heard the doctors saying he needed evacuation, but it would have to wait because all the birds were committed to Italy. He paused, jaw working. I also heard them say, quietly, that they didn't think he'd make it 24 hours. They were already preparing to tell you they'd lost him. Margaret made a small sound. The Admiral's hand tightened on her arm. Then, about 4 hours later, word came down that an evac bird was being diverted for Commander Holbrook. One patient. The medical staff couldn't believe it. Nobody gets a dedicated medevac diverted from a mass casualty event. It doesn't happen. He stepped closer. But it happened. And I watched them load your husband onto that aircraft. And I remember thinking someone must have moved heaven and earth. Someone must have loved that man enough to break every rule in the book. Richardson's voice grew stronger. What I didn't know until years later was that someone was you. And what I didn't know until today was that your fight to save your husband ended up saving my son. Margaret's eyes widened. My son, David Jr., enlisted in the Marines in 2004, deployed to Fallujah in 2005. His convoy was hit by an IED, shrapnel to the abdomen and legs. The field medics didn't have enough blood for transfusion. But they had a protocol for emergency donor recruitment and rapid field transfusion, a protocol that came from that cargo plane crash in Italy in 1985. He stopped, struggling to continue. They used that protocol. They saved my son's life. He came home, he recovered, he's a teacher now, married, with 2 daughters, and he exists because 40 years ago you refused to let your husband die. Richardson came to attention and rendered the sharpest salute of his career. Thank you, Mrs. Holbrook. Thank you for my son. Thank you for my grandchildren. Thank you for giving me a future I would never have had without you. Margaret couldn't hold it back anymore. The tears came in a flood. She stood there crying openly as Richardson returned to his seat. But there were others. So many others. A woman in her 50s stepped forward. Mrs. Holbrook, I'm Dr. Sarah Chen. I'm a trauma surgeon at Walter Reed. In medical school, I studied emergency blood donation protocols developed in 1985. That case inspired my entire career. I've served in Iraq, Afghanistan, numerous humanitarian crises. I've saved hundreds of lives using principles that came from that innovation. And I never knew that innovation came from your phone calls until today. An older submarine veteran spoke next. Ma'am, I was on the USS Dallas in 1986. We had a flooding casualty, 3 men trapped. Under old protocols, evacuation options were limited. But new procedures had just been implemented, procedures from the reforms your case triggered. Those procedures saved my shipmate's life. A young ensign stepped forward nervously. Mrs. Holbrook, I just graduated from the academy. In our leadership class, they taught us about a Navy wife who fought through the system and reformed how we handle medical emergencies and family communications. They said that case was the foundation for modern family readiness programs. Because of what you did, the Navy I'm serving in values families and listens to spouses. One after another they came forward, a Master Chief saved by updated evacuation protocols in the Gulf War, a widow whose husband received better care because communication procedures had been reformed, a retired admiral who'd implemented the policy changes and watched them save countless lives. Each story was different. Each story was the same. Each one was a thread in a tapestry Margaret had never known she was weaving. A life that connected back to that desperate day when she'd picked up a phone and refused to accept the unacceptable. Finally, an older man stood from the back row, late 70s, veteran's blazer with submarine dolphins. He walked slowly, leaning on a cane. The crowd parted as he made his way forward. When he reached the stage, he looked up at Margaret with eyes that held decades of wisdom and pain. Mrs. Holbrook, you don't know me, but I know you. My name is Master Chief Petty Officer James Sullivan, retired. In 1985, I was the senior medical corpsman on the USS Ranger. I was in the operating room when they brought your husband in. I assisted in his surgery. He paused, gathering himself. I was also there when the captain asked us to write a report about what had happened. Not a typical incident report, but a comprehensive analysis of the decision-making process, the resource allocation, the systemic factors that had put us in a position where we had to tell a wife her husband couldn't be evacuated despite life-threatening injuries. Sullivan's hand tightened on his cane. That report became the foundation for everything that followed. The protocol changes, the communication reforms, the family advocacy programs. All of it started with that report, which started with your phone calls, which started with your love for your husband. He looked directly into Margaret's eyes. But there's something else you need to know, something classified for 35 years. The reason the medical evacuation aircraft were committed to Italy wasn't just the cargo plane crash. It was a classified operation that had gone wrong, requiring immediate medical support. Your phone calls forced senior leadership to make a choice they didn't want to make. Margaret's face went pale. This was what she'd always feared, that someone had died because Bobby had lived. Sullivan shook his head firmly. No, ma'am, listen to me. The choice wasn't between saving your husband and saving someone else. The choice was between maintaining classified status of a failed operation and admitting that mistakes had been made, that priorities had been misaligned, that the system was broken. He stepped closer. Your phone calls exposed those failures. They forced leadership to confront the fact that we didn't have adequate medical evacuation resources, that our protocols were inflexible, that we weren't accounting for family concerns. You didn't take resources from other casualties. You revealed that we didn't have enough resources to begin with, and that revelation led to changes that ensured we'd never be in that position again. Sullivan stood straighter. So on behalf of every corpsman, every doctor, every medical professional who served in the Navy over the past 40 years, thank you. You didn't just save your husband. You forced us to be better than we were. You held us accountable. You reminded us that every life matters, that the system exists to serve the people in it, not the other way around. Sullivan rendered a salute, hand trembling but posture straight. Thank you, Mrs. Holbrook. Thank you for your courage. Thank you for changing the United States Navy. The hall erupted again, but Margaret barely heard it. She was staring at Sullivan, seeing him as he must have been then, a young corpsman holding her husband's life in his hands. Bobby made it, she said suddenly, voice cutting through the applause. The room quieted immediately. Bobby survived. He recovered. It took 2 years of rehabilitation, but he walked again. He never flew again, but he lived. We had 38 more years together. He died last year, peacefully, with me holding his hand. She looked out at the crowd, voice growing stronger. Those 38 years were a gift. Every day was a gift. Watching our sons grow up, serve their own Navy careers, that was a gift. Meeting our grandchildren, building a life together, that was a gift. Margaret's eyes shone with something that looked like wonder. But I never knew. All these years I never knew those 38 years with Bobby were just the beginning of the gift. I never knew that our love, our fight to stay together, had rippled out and touched so many other lives. I never knew that other wives got to keep their husbands, other children got to keep their fathers, because Bobby and I fought for our time together. She looked at the Admiral, then at Sullivan, then at Richardson and all the others. You've given me something today I can't repay. You've shown me that love doesn't end with 2 people, that when you fight for the person you love, you're somehow fighting for everyone. That the refusal to accept loss means something bigger than any of us can see in the moment. The Admiral stepped forward and placed a small velvet box in Margaret's hands. She opened it to find a medal, not official military decoration, but something created specifically for this moment. It bore the Navy's anchor and eagle, surrounded by words, "For changing the system by refusing to accept loss." With gratitude from the sailors you saved without ever wearing the uniform. Margaret held the medal, feeling its weight, understanding what it represented. Not just recognition, but absolution from 40 years of unnecessary guilt. "Will you say a few words?" the Admiral asked gently. Margaret nodded. She stepped to the microphone, voice clear and strong. To everyone who thanked me today, you don't owe me thanks. We owe each other. That's what service means. When I fought for Bobby's life, I was being selfish. I wanted my husband. I wanted my sons to have their father. I didn't think about protocols or anyone else. I just thought about him. She paused. But here's what I learned today. Sometimes our most selfish acts of love turn out to be the most generous things we ever do. Sometimes fighting for the one person in front of us ends up helping thousands we'll never meet. Sometimes refusing to accept the way things are creates space for them to become what they should be. Margaret looked out at the sea of faces. So if you want to thank me, pay it forward. The next time you see a broken system, speak up. The next time someone tells you to accept the unacceptable, make phone calls. The next time you have a choice between procedure and what's right, choose right. And the next time you love someone, love them with everything you have, because that love might just change the world. Silence absorbed her words. Then as 300 people came to attention and rendered a salute. Military personnel in perfect form, veterans as straight as aging bodies would allow, civilians with hands over hearts. They held it there for Margaret Holbrook, the woman who'd picked up a phone 40 years ago and refused to accept loss. The woman who'd loved so fiercely she'd torn down walls and rebuilt systems. The woman who'd spent 4 decades thinking she was selfish when she'd actually been the most selfless person in the room. Margaret stood on that stage, surrounded by evidence of a life well lived and a love that had refused to end. And finally, she let herself accept what they'd been trying to tell her all along. She was a hero, not despite her love, but because of it. When the salutes finally dropped, when 300 hands returned to sides and hearts, something in the room had fundamentally shifted. What had begun as a formal reunion ceremony had transformed into something no one had planned for. A living testament to the power of one person's refusal to give up and the ripples that refusal had created across 4 decades. The Admiral stepped back, giving Margaret space, and what happened next was entirely spontaneous. It started with the young ensign who'd spoken earlier, the one fresh out of the academy. He moved into the aisle and walked toward the stage, his steps uncertain but determined. When he reached Margaret, he came to attention. "Ma'am," he said, voice thick with emotion, "I just want to shake your hand. I want to be able to tell my future children that I met you, that I heard your story directly from you, because this is the kind of service I want to give. This is the Navy I want to be part of." Margaret took his hand, and the young man's composure cracked. Tears streamed down his face as he held her hand in both of his. "Thank you for showing me what real leadership looks like," he whispered. And then the floodgates opened. People began moving toward the stage from every direction, not in an organized line, but in a spontaneous surge of humanity that the Admiral and his staff quickly worked to manage into something resembling order. They formed a queue down the center aisle, and one by one, they came to Margaret. An older captain approached, his uniform heavy with the medals of a career that had spanned 3 decades. "Mrs. Holbrook, I implemented the family communication protocols that came from your case when I commanded a carrier strike group in 2008. Those protocols allowed us to keep families informed during a crisis in ways we'd never been able to before. I watched the difference it made. I watched spouses feel valued instead of shut out. Thank you for that." A female commander was next, and she wasn't in uniform. She wore civilian clothes, but carried herself with unmistakable military bearing. "Ma'am, I'm a military spouse myself. My husband's a submarine officer. He's deployed right now, actually. But because of the reforms that came from your actions, I have access to better communication, better support networks, better resources when emergencies happen. I'm not alone in the dark, the way spouses used to be. You did that for all of us." A Master Chief approached with his wife, both in their 70s. The Master Chief's voice was gruff, but gentle. "Mrs. Holbrook, my wife and I have been married 52 years. I spent 30 of those years at sea. The hardest thing about naval service isn't the deployments or the danger, it's what it does to the families left behind. But because of you, the Navy got better at supporting those families. It got better at recognizing that sailors don't serve alone. Their families serve with them. You changed that culture, ma'am. You made it okay for spouses to speak up, to advocate, to demand better. Thank you for that. His wife stepped forward, tears streaming. You gave us a voice, she said simply. For so long, we were supposed to just smile and wait and not make waves. But you made waves, Mrs. Holbrook. You showed us that love is worth fighting for, that family matters, that we matter. Thank you. A young lieutenant approached, holding the hand of a small boy, maybe 6 years old. Mrs. Holbrook, this is my son, Tyler. I wanted him to meet you because I want him to understand something about service. I want him to know that heroes don't just wear uniforms. Sometimes heroes are the people who love us, who fight for us, who refuse to accept that we're expendable. My father was a Navy pilot. He was injured in a training accident in 1997. The updated medical evacuation protocols saved his life. If not for you, I wouldn't have grown up with my dad. Tyler wouldn't have his grandfather. Our family wouldn't exist the way it does. The little boy looked up at Margaret with wide eyes. Thank you for saving my grandpa, he said in a small voice. Margaret knelt down, her knees protesting but her heart overruling the discomfort. She took the boy's hands in hers. Your grandpa saved himself by being brave enough to serve, she said gently. But I'm glad he was there for you. I'm glad you got to know him. That's what matters most, that families stay together. The boy nodded solemnly, then suddenly threw his arms around Margaret's neck in an impulsive hug. Margaret held him, and for a moment she wasn't in a memorial hall surrounded by hundreds of people. She was back in 1985, holding her own sons, 6 and 4 years old, trying to explain why Daddy wasn't coming home on time, trying to hide her terror that he might never come home at all. When the boy pulled back, Margaret had to wipe her eyes before she could stand again. The Admiral was there immediately, offering his hand to help her up, his eyes conveying both concern and deep respect. The line continued. A submarine veteran who'd served on 6 different boats over 25 years, each one benefiting from improved medical protocols. A Navy nurse who'd trained using the procedures developed from the 1985 innovations. A chaplain who'd counseled countless families and seen firsthand how better communication systems helped them cope with the stress of military life. Captain Richardson came through the line again, this time with his son, the Marine who'd been saved in Fallujah. David Jr. was in his late 30s now, fit and healthy, no visible signs of the injuries that had nearly killed him. He looked at Margaret with an intensity that spoke of someone who understood exactly how fragile life could be. Mrs. Holbrook, he said, my dad told me what you did. I just wanted to thank you personally, not just for the protocol that saved me, but for showing me what it means to fight for the people you love. I'm a teacher now. I teach high school history, and I'm going to tell my students your story. I'm going to tell them that one person, acting out of love and refusing to accept injustice, can change systems that seem unchangeable. That's the most important lesson I can teach them. Margaret's response was barely a whisper. Just love the people in front of you. That's all any of us can do. Master Chief Sullivan came through the line, moving slowly with his cane. When he reached Margaret, he didn't say anything at first. He just looked at her with eyes that had seen 4 decades of naval medicine, 4 decades of watching the reforms they'd implemented save life after life. Finally, he spoke. I've been waiting 40 years to tell you something, Mrs. Holbrook. In all my years of service, through all the changes I witnessed, through all the lives I helped save, I never forgot your husband. I never forgot loading him onto that aircraft and wondering if he'd make it. And I never forgot that somewhere out there was a woman who'd loved him enough to move heaven and earth. I wanted you to know that he mattered to us, that we cared, that we tried our best. Margaret gripped his hand. I know you did. I've always known that. The doctors, the corpsmen, the pilots, everyone tried their best. I never blamed any of you. I just couldn't accept that best wasn't good enough. So I kept pushing until I found a way to make it better." Sullivan nodded, a look of profound relief crossing his face, as if he'd been carrying a burden of his own for 40 years and had finally been given permission to set it down. "That's what made the difference, Ma'am. You didn't accept good enough. You demanded better, and you made us all better in the process." The line continued for over an hour. Person after person, story after story, each one a testament to how a single act of love and defiance had cascaded through time and space, touching lives in ways Margaret had never imagined. A woman approached who looked to be in her 50s, wearing gold star motherpin on her lapel. Margaret's heart clenched. This was someone who'd lost a child in service. The woman's eyes were red, but she smiled through her tears. "Mrs. Holbrook, my son died in Afghanistan in 2011. He was a Navy corpsman attached to a Marine unit. He was killed trying to save his brothers in arms." She paused, struggling with emotion. "But the other Marines in his unit survived because of the medical training he had, training that included the protocols developed from your case. And when he died, the Navy's family support system, the system that was reformed because of you, they were there for me. They helped me through the worst time of my life. I couldn't save my son, but knowing that he saved others, and knowing that I wasn't alone in my grief because of the support systems you helped create, that's meant everything." Margaret pulled the woman into an embrace, and they stood there holding each other, two mothers who understood the terrible cost of service, who knew that some sacrifices couldn't be undone, but could be honored by making sure they meant something, by making sure the system became worthy of the people who gave everything to it. Media representatives who'd been present for the reunion ceremony were capturing all of this, their cameras documenting what was clearly becoming a historic moment. But they did so respectfully, keeping their distance, understanding that this was sacred ground they were witnessing. As the line finally began to thin, the Admiral approached Margaret again. "Mrs. Holbrook, I know this has been overwhelming, but there's one more thing. The memorial wall in the hall. It lists the names of class of 85 graduates who've passed away. Your husband's name is there, Lieutenant Commander Robert Holbrook. Would you like to see it?" Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice. The Admiral offered his arm, and together they walked to the side of the hall, where a large marble wall bore the engraved names of the fallen. Margaret's eyes scanned the list until she found it. LCDR, Robert J. Holbrook, USN, 1959-2024. She placed her hand on the engraving, feeling the letters carved into the stone. "He would have loved this," she said softly. "Not the attention on him, but this. All these people, all these stories, all these connections. He always said the Navy was about people taking care of each other. He would have loved knowing that we're all still taking care of each other." The Admiral's voice was gentle. "He knew, Mrs. Holbrook. I guarantee you he knew. A man who inspired that kind of love understood what it meant." Margaret stood there for a long moment, her hand on Bobby's name, surrounded by the quiet conversations of people who were still processing what they'd witnessed. The formal ceremony was long forgotten. No one cared about the prepared speeches or the planned program. This spontaneous outpouring of gratitude and connection had become something far more meaningful than any scripted event could have been. Finally, Margaret turned back to the room. The crowd had largely returned to their seats, but no one had left. They were waiting, though for what, even they might not have known. Margaret walked slowly back to the stage, and when she stood at the podium again, silence fell naturally. "I came here today thinking I was visiting the past," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the sound system. "I thought I was paying respects to memories, to a time in my life that was over. But you've all shown me something different. You've shown me that the past isn't really past, that the things we do out of love continue forward in ways we can't see or predict, that every act of courage, every refusal to accept injustice, every moment when we choose to fight for what matters, all of it continues. All of it ripples forward. She paused, looking out at the faces watching her. Bobby used to tell our sons that the measure of a life isn't in the glory or the recognition. It's in whether you made things better for the people who come after you. He lived that way, he served that way, and apparently without knowing it, I did too. We did it together. Margaret's voice grew stronger. So I'm not going to say goodbye to this day feeling honored or special. I'm going to leave here feeling grateful. Grateful that love turns out to be stronger than systems. Grateful that ordinary people doing extraordinary things out of desperation can change the world. Grateful that I'm surrounded by a family, and you are family, all of you, that understands what it means to serve, to sacrifice, and to take care of each other. She smiled, and it was the first genuine smile anyone had seen from her since she'd walked through that door. Thank you for standing up when I walked in. Thank you for showing me that I mattered. But most of all, thank you for being the kind of people who understand that we're all in this together, that every life matters, and that love, stubborn, determined, refusing to quit love, is the most powerful force there is. The room erupted one final time, but this time it wasn't just applause. It was cheers, it was tears, it was people embracing each other and sharing stories and connecting in ways that transcended rank and generation and time. The ceremony had become something none of them would ever forget, a reminder of why they served, why they sacrificed, why it all mattered. Margaret stood in the center of it all, no longer trying to be invisible, no longer running from recognition, finally accepting that her story, her and Bobby's story, was a gift she could give to others, a gift of hope, of possibility, of the enduring power of love to change everything. The Admiral stood beside her, watching his carefully planned ceremony dissolve into beautiful chaos, and he couldn't stop smiling. Because this messy, emotional, spontaneous outpouring of connection, this was what service was really about. This was the Navy at its best. And it had all started because one woman walked through a door 20 minutes late, and everyone stood up to say, "We see you, we remember you, we honor you, and we're better because of you." The ceremony officially ended 2 hours after it was scheduled to conclude, but no one seemed to mind. As people finally began filtering out of the Memorial Hall into the late afternoon sunshine, they carried something with them that hadn't been there when they'd arrived, a renewed sense of purpose, a deeper understanding of what service really meant, and a story they would tell for the rest of their lives. Margaret stood near the entrance, the Admiral still at her side, as people stopped to say final goodbyes. The young ensign approached one more time, his eyes still red, but his bearing straight and proud. "Ma'am, I just wanted you to know I'm going to be different because of today. I'm going to remember that leadership isn't just about following procedure. It's about knowing when to break procedure, because something more important is at stake." Margaret squeezed his hand. "Just take care of your sailors, and when you have a family someday, let them know they matter too. That's all the Navy needs from you." Captain Richardson's son, the Marine who'd survived Fallujah, stopped with his father. "Mrs. Holbrook, my dad and I are going to write about this, about you. We want people to understand that the military doesn't just need warriors. It needs people who care enough to demand better for those warriors. Would that be okay?" Margaret nodded. "If it helps even one person find their voice, if it helps even one family feel less alone, then yes. Tell the story. Just make sure people understand it wasn't about me. It was about what happens when ordinary people refuse to accept that loved ones are expendable." The Gold Star mother who'd lost her son in Afghanistan embraced Margaret one more time. "You've given me something today I didn't know I needed. You've shown me that my son's death wasn't meaningless, that the system he died serving is trying to be worthy of that sacrifice. Thank you for that gift." As the crowd thinned, Master Chief Sullivan approached with a small group of retired corpsmen, all men who'd served in naval medicine over the past 4 decades. Sullivan spoke for all of them. Mrs. Holbrook, we made a decision. Every year, the Navy Medical Corps gives out awards for innovation in tactical medicine and family support programs. Starting next year, we're establishing the Margaret Holbrook Award for advocacy and innovation. It'll go to someone who challenges the system to be better, who refuses to accept good enough, who fights for the people the system is supposed to serve. We want your story to inspire generations to come. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. I don't know what to say. Say you'll come to the ceremony next year when we present the first one, Sullivan said. Say you'll keep telling this story so others can learn from it. I will, Margaret promised. As Sullivan departed, the Admiral turned to Margaret. There's something I need to show you before you go. Will you come with me? Margaret followed him through a side door into a smaller adjacent room, a library with walls lined with photographs and memorabilia from naval history. The Admiral led her to a glass case in the center. Inside was a collection of documents, including what appeared to be an official report dated July 1985. This is the report Master Chief Sullivan mentioned, the Admiral explained. The comprehensive analysis that came from your case. It's been declassified now. I wanted you to see it, to understand the full scope of what happened. Margaret leaned closer, reading the title page. Medical Evacuation Protocols and Family Advocacy. Lessons Learned from the USS Ranger Incident, June 1985. The Admiral pointed to a paragraph. Read this part. Margaret read aloud, her voice soft. The actions of Mrs. Margaret Holbrook in advocating for her husband's emergency medical evacuation exposed critical flaws in existing protocols. Her persistence, while initially viewed as problematic interference, ultimately revealed systemic inadequacies that endangered service members' lives. Her refusal to accept bureaucratic obstacles forced a necessary examination of priorities and led to reforms that have since saved countless lives. Margaret's voice broke. She looked at the Admiral through tears. They actually acknowledged that I was right to push? More than that, they made your actions the foundation for change. This report has been required reading at the Naval Medical Center for decades. Every corpsman, every Navy doctor studies this case. Your name has been in Navy medical textbooks for 40 years. He paused. When your husband passed away last year, his obituary mentioned the 1985 incident. That's when current Navy leadership decided it was time to honor you publicly. That's why the invitation included that line about those who made their service possible. We were talking about you, Margaret. We were inviting you home to a family that never forgot you. Margaret stared at the case. Bobby never told me it had become this. He knew, didn't he? He probably thought you'd lived through it once and didn't need to relive it, the Admiral suggested gently. But he also knew that someday, when you were ready, you'd need to understand what your love had built. That day is today. The Admiral guided her back to the main hall, now mostly empty. Margaret walked to the memorial wall one more time, placing her hand on Bobby's name. You knew, she whispered to the engraved letters. All these years, you knew what we'd done together, and you let me think it was just us. But it was never just us, was it? When she turned back, the Admiral held a folded American flag. This isn't the flag from your husband's service. This is a new flag, flown over the Naval Academy yesterday in honor of both of you, in honor of Lieutenant Commander Robert Holbrook's service to his country, and in honor of your service to every sailor and family that came after him. Margaret received the flag with trembling hands, clutching it to her chest. For 40 years she'd felt unmoored, floating between the terror of almost loss and the guilt of diverting resources. But this flag, this recognition, this day, they anchored her to a truth she could finally accept. She hadn't just been Bobby's wife. She'd been part of his service. They'd served together. Thank you, Margaret said, her voice steady now. Thank you for letting me serve, even though I never wore the uniform. Thank you for showing me that love is service too. The Admiral came to attention and rendered one final salute. Thank you, Mrs. Holbrook, for your service, for your sacrifice. for showing us all what it means to fight for what matters most." Margaret walked out of the Memorial Hall into the golden light of late afternoon. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows across the parking lot where people were still standing in small groups, talking animately, promising to stay in touch. The ceremony had ended, but the connections it had created were just beginning. A young couple approached, the lieutenant with his 6-year-old son who'd hugged Margaret earlier. "Mrs. Holbrook, could we take a picture with you? We want Tyler to remember this day." The boy suddenly asked. "Are you famous?" Margaret laughed. "No, sweetheart. I'm just someone who loved her husband very much. That's all." "My dad says you're a hero," the boy insisted. Margaret looked up at the lieutenant, who nodded firmly. She turned back to Tyler. "Heroes are just people who love someone enough to not give up. Your daddy is a hero because he serves our country. Your mommy is a hero because she takes care of you while he's away. And someday, if you love someone with all your heart and fight for them when they need you, you'll be a hero too. That's the secret. We're all heroes when we love each other that much." Captain Richardson approached one more time, alone now. "Mrs. Holbrook, when I helped carry your husband to that operating room 40 years ago, I was scared. I could see how bad it was, and I knew we probably couldn't save him. I remember thinking how unfair it was that this man might die because we didn't have the resources we needed." His voice grew thick. "But then the miracle happened. Your husband lived. And I watched over the years as the system changed. And every time I saw those changes save someone, I thought about you. When my son was hit in Fallujah, when I got that call every military parent dreads, I thought about you then too. I thought about how you'd fought for Bobby, and I knew I had to trust that the system would fight for my son. And it did. It brought him home." Margaret pulled him into an embrace. When they pulled apart, both were smiling through tears. "Take care of that son and those granddaughters. That's the only payment I need. Just love them with everything you have." Margaret turned to look back at the Memorial Hall one more time. The building stood solid and dignified in the late afternoon light, its flags moving gently in the breeze. She thought about Bobby, so young when his plane went down, so close to becoming one more name on one more memorial wall. Bobby, who'd survived and lived 38 more years, who'd held his grandchildren and watched his sons become men and grown old beside the woman who'd refused to let him go. She walked slowly to the flagpole beside the Memorial Hall entrance. The American flag moved lazily in the breeze, the late sun making the stripes glow. She stood beneath it, holding the folded flag the Admiral had given her, and let herself feel everything she'd been holding back for 40 years. The fear of that terrible day, the desperation of making call after call, the relief when Bobby had survived, the guilt she'd carried, thinking she'd taken something from someone else. And now, finally, the peace of understanding that love didn't take, it multiplied, that fighting for one person had somehow become fighting for everyone. She thought about all the lives that had intersected with hers in ways she'd never imagined. The captain's son teaching high school instead of dying in Iraq, the surgeon who devoted her career to tactical medicine, the young ensign who would carry today's lessons forward. All of it connected, all of it mattered, all of it flowed from one desperate phone call made by a terrified wife who'd simply refused to accept that love wasn't enough. Margaret looked up at the flag moving against the blue sky. "We did it, Bobby. We changed things, not just for us, but for all of them. I wish you were here to see it. But maybe you can. Maybe wherever you are, you know that our love didn't end with us. It kept going. It's still going." The breeze picked up, moving the flag more vigorously, and Margaret smiled. She'd take that as Bobby's answer. She turned and walked back toward the parking lot where the Admiral was waiting. As she approached, she saw that a small group had gathered. Master Chief Sullivan, Captain Richardson with his family, Dr. Chen, the young ensign, and several others. They weren't blocking her path or demanding anything. They were simply there, showing that she was part of their family now, and they didn't let family leave alone. "You've given me something today I can never repay," Margaret said. "You've given me back my own story, but not the way I'd been telling it to myself. You've shown me the true version, the bigger version, the version where love wins and systems change and people take care of each other." The young ensign stepped forward. "Ma'am, we're the ones who received the gift. You showed us what we're really serving. Not just our country, not just freedom, but each other. The person standing next to us, the family waiting at home, the stranger who needs someone to fight for them. That's what the uniform really means. You taught us that today." The Admiral opened the vehicle door for her, and she climbed in, still clutching the folded flag. As the vehicle pulled away, she looked back through the rear window. They were all still standing there, watching her leave. And as the vehicle turned onto the main road, she saw them, every single one, come to attention and render a final salute. Not to her as an individual, but to what she represented, to the power of love to change everything, to the strength of families who serve alongside those in uniform. Margaret returned the salute through the window, holding it until the Memorial Hall disappeared from view. That evening, Margaret sat in her living room, the folded flag resting on the mantel beside the case that held Bobby's medals. She'd placed it there carefully, knowing it belonged next to his service record, knowing they'd served together even when she hadn't understood that truth. On the coffee table, her phone buzzed constantly with messages. The lieutenant had shared photos. Captain Richardson had sent an invitation to visit his family. The academy had invited her to speak at next year's ceremony. Master Chief Sullivan had sent details about the award being established in her name. But Margaret wasn't looking at her phone. She was looking at a photo album, pictures of Bobby throughout their years together. Bobby in his flight suit, young and confident. Bobby in a hospital bed, bruised but alive, holding her hand. Bobby learning to walk again, determined to recover. Bobby at their son's academy graduation. Bobby holding their first grandchild. Bobby and Margaret on their 50th wedding anniversary, both grey and weathered, but their clasped hands still strong. "I understand now," she whispered to his photo. "I understand what we did. You protected me from the weight of being a symbol. You wanted me to just be your wife. But I'm ready now. I'm ready to carry it forward, to tell the story, to help other people understand that love is strong enough to change systems." Tomorrow, she'd respond to the messages. She'd accept the invitation to speak. She'd work with Sullivan on the award criteria. She'd share her story. She'd do all the things that would ensure the lessons of that desperate day continued to ripple forward, continued to change lives, continued to remind people that love was the most powerful force in the universe. But tonight, she'd simply sit with Bobby's memory and feel grateful. Grateful for every moment they'd shared, grateful for every life their love had touched, grateful for a system that, despite its flaws, had proven capable of change when pushed by someone who cared enough to demand better, grateful for a room full of strangers who'd shown her that she'd never been alone. Outside her window, the American flag she'd hung when Bobby passed moved gently in the evening breeze. She'd left it up long past the traditional mourning period. Now she understood she'd never take it down. It would fly there as a reminder, not of loss, but of service. Not of one man's sacrifice, but of what happened when love refused to surrender. Margaret stood and walked to the flag on the mantel, running her fingers over the precise folds. Then she carried it upstairs and placed it on Bobby's side of the bed, where he'd slept for 38 years after that terrible day in June 1985. "You served with honor," she told the flag, told Bobby's memory, told herself, "and so did I. We served together, and we're still serving, still teaching, still showing people that love and duty aren't separate things. They're the same thing." Vidin, she lay down on her own side of the bed, one hand resting on the folded flag, and for the first time in the year since Bobby had died, she felt not alone, but accompanied. Accompanied by his memory, yes, but also by the knowledge that their story continued in hundreds of lives they'd touched, thousands of lives they'd saved, countless lives they'd changed without even knowing it. If you've ever loved someone so much that you'd move heaven and earth for them, you understand what Margaret Holbrook did. If you've ever refused to accept that someone you love is expendable, you understand her fight. And if you've ever wondered whether one person can change the world, remember this story. Remember that a single phone call made out of desperate love can ripple forward through 40 years and save thousands of lives. Margaret Holbrook walked into a ceremony late, and everyone stood up. Not because she was famous, not because she wore a uniform, not because she'd done something extraordinary by military standards. They stood up because she'd done something extraordinarily human. She'd loved someone so fiercely that she'd refused to accept loss, and in refusing, she'd changed everything. Love doesn't just save the person in front of you. It saves everyone who comes after. It changes systems. It reforms protocols. It reminds us all that behind every uniform is a family, and those families deserve our very best effort. So honor the Margaret Holbrooks in your own life. Honor the people who fight for their loved ones. Honor the spouses who wait and worry. Honor the families who serve alongside those in uniform, because they're serving too. They're all serving, and their love, stubborn, determined, refusing to quit love, is changing the world in ways we'll never fully understand. That's the legacy. That's the lesson. That's why everyone stood up, because love, in the end, is the most powerful force there is. And when you combine love with the refusal to accept injustice, with the courage to make one more phone call, with the determination to believe that one life matters, you create something that echoes through generations. You create change, you create hope, you create a better world for everyone who comes after. That's what Margaret and Bobby Holbrook gave us. That's what their story means. And that's why, 40 years later, 300 people stood up when she walked through that door. They were standing for love. They were standing for family. They were standing for the truth that we're all in this together, that every life matters, and that sometimes the greatest act of service is simply refusing to let go of the person you love. Stand up for the people you love. Fight for them. Refuse to accept that they're expendable. Make the phone calls. Break the rules when the rules are wrong. Demand better from systems that should serve us all. Because somewhere, 40 years from now, someone you'll never meet will be alive because you refuse to give up. That's the legacy we all can leave. That's the service we all can give. That's the world we all can build, one stubborn act of love at a time.